Today we have Dr. Julia Nicholls, who's a lecturer in French and European Studies at King's College London. She completed 2 of her degrees here at Cambridge and completed her PhD in history at Queen Mary University of London. Her thesis explored French revolutionary thought after the Paris Commune, a topic she has been working on in some form or the other since her undergraduate degree. In 2019, her work culminated in the book Revolutionary Thought After the Paris Commune between 1871 and 1885, published by Cambridge University Press. Julia's research areas are expansive, and she has also published extensively on the 19th century French history, French and European political and social thought, French imperial history, and histories of Marxism and Socialism. Her new ongoing research looks at slavery and wage labor in 19th century French thought. Today, Julia's talk is titled Marx, Marxists, and Marxism in Paris and London between 1871 and 1889. We are very excited to hear you, Julia. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start by extending my thanks to the whole organizing committee for inviting me to speak at this really great conference. It's such an interesting topic, and I've really enjoyed the papers that I've been able to listen to so far. I'm really looking forward to the ones tomorrow as well. Historically, about the relationship between Marxism in Britain and in France in the 1870s and the 1880s. So I'm going to be drawing on research that I did for the book that was just mentioned on revolutionary thought after the Paris Commune. So in other words, I guess, towards the end of Marx's life, I think he died in 1883. So actually, Marx and Engels are the British part of this paper, even though obviously they're not British, but they lived in London. So I'm just going to share my screen. In November 1882, Engels famously noted in a letter to Edward Bernstein that frustration at the so-called French Marxists had recently led Marx to declare, "What is certain is that I myself am not a Marxist." So I think, this is possibly apocryphal, who knows, but the message here is kind of, loud and clear whether he actually said it or not. Firstly, French Marxism was dangerous or banal, not to be trusted, possibly all of those things. And secondly, separate and distinct from the Marxism that was being produced by Marx in London. So French Marxism wasn't to be associated with. Unlike the genuine British article, the genuine article produced in London, it couldn't really be called Marxism at all. So I think that the study of Marx and of Marxism in France during this period has really suffered from, remarks like these, remarks like Engels for quite a long time. So, for example, in his 1966 classic Marxism in Modern France, George Lichtheim dismissed the beginning of the 1880s as, quote, a dead loss in terms of the implantation of socialist theory in France. So his idea is that it wasn't until, the 1890s, basically, with the rise of people like Jean Jaurès, who more sophisticated theorists, essentially, that Marx's ideas really began to make an impact in France, really began to infiltrate France. And a lot more recent work on French socialism has adopted a kind of different focus, but the perception that there weren't any true Marxists in the 1880s, or until the late 1880s in France, has remained. So I don't want to kind of, go into reel off a list of who these books are or what these books are, but essentially, if we kind of generalize, they constructed a different genealogy of French socialism, where Marx wasn't actually really that important. Marxism wasn't that important. And no French socialists, even the French Marxists, could really be called Marxists. So, the explanation for what had happened or what was happening in French socialism, for the position that it held during that period, wasn't in Marxism, but it was in something else, whether that's, institutions, trade unions, things like that, or the appeal of a kind of a longer non-Marxist French tradition. So in both of those bodies of literature, we see reproduced a similar separation to the one implied by Engels in 1882. Firstly, that there exists an authentic Marxism, and that is the one that was articulated by Marx himself in London. And secondly, that true Marxism didn't make it to France during this period. So, in this paper, I want to argue that this isn't an accurate picture of Marxism in this period, either French Marxism or in London. And in its place, I want to suggest several different things. So, firstly, that Marxist ideas and language were a lot more frequent. They featured more frequently and in more nuanced ways in French socialist thought during this period than we might have previously thought. And secondly, that the relationship between Marxist ideas and activists in Britain and in France, or French activists, of course they were in exile. Many of them were in exile after the Paris Commune until 1880. But that relationship wasn't characterized mainly by distance or by separation. That actually, despite their differences, Marx and the French Marxists and other French socialists as well worked together to create a fluid, adaptable, context-specific Marxism that was always conceived of as something of a transnational or a cross-channel enterprise. So the paper is split into two parts. So in the first part, I want to look at Marx himself and Marx's involvement in French thought and action. And in the second part, I want to move from Marx to the internal kind of dynamics of Marxism in French thought and the way that that was constructed. So this period, the 1870s and the 1880s, was really kind of a period, and I said it was towards the end of Marx's life, but it was really a period in which he could kind of truly be described to have arrived on kind of the scene, right? So, his 1871 work on the Paris Commune, the Civil War in France, along with his work in the International Working Men's Association from the 1860s, and the widespread reissuing of the Communist Manifesto from 1872 onwards, brought him really a kind of a general public awareness on a level that he had not had before. France was really no exception to this. So activists who have been involved in the First International, and this was many people, many French socialists became involved in the First International after 1871, established a French Workers' Party. French translations of Marx also underwent something of a kind of a boom during this period. So before 1871, there hadn't really been that much translation of Marx's work. And he didn't, there were not very many original titles in French. But between 1871 and 1885, major translations of Capital, of the Manifesto, and of the Civil War in France all appeared, sometimes several of each title. Sometimes they were serialized in newspapers so more people could read them. And this was important because the majority of French socialists during this period didn't speak any German. So in 1885, when he received the second volume of Capital, the French socialist and also Marxist son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, confessed to Engels in a letter that he and his friends couldn't understand it. They were, he said, like monkeys turning over and over nuts that they cannot crack. So, as I said, Marx had written barely any text originally in French. So any kind of sustained access to his thought had always been, up to this point, quite limited. But in this period, the increase in translations gave French readers for the first time access to his thought on a meaningful level, and the chance to engage with him as a philosopher and as a social critic, not just as an activist. So these translations, I think, haven't really been mentioned or examined that much by historians. And actually, if you read lots of books on socialists from this period in France, particularly, they can't even agree on basic facts, like when the translations were first issued, when they first appeared. And I mean, I should say that Kevin Anderson is really the exception here, and his work on the French translation of Capital. But these translations were actually very important, not only because a lot of people read them, but also because the translations often differed from the original. But in this case, the changes they're worth noting. So some of them aren't, none of these changes are particularly big. Some of them are a little more than simplifications or clarifications, but others actually appreciably change the tone of the text. So I want to spend a few minutes looking at one example from this, or one example of this. So the example that I'm going to use is a passage from the first volume of Capital. Specifically, it's from chapter 15, section 4, on the factory. So the first volume of Capital first appeared in German in 1867, and the French translation followed 5 years later. So Le Capital was issued between 1872 and 1875. And it was issued initially in small installments that were priced at 10 centimes each. And this was a strategy that the publisher hoped would, quote, enable as many of our friends, i.e. the working class, as possible to get hold of copies. And then after this kind of serialization was complete, a complete book version appeared in 1875. So the factory saw Marx return to a familiar topic, the ways in which the modern industrial workplace had transformed the relationship between workers and their tools, and the effects that this had had upon the laborer as well. So, building upon the premises that he had established in earlier work, Marx claimed that technological advancements and the invention of machinery that could perform the tasks of multiple workers had drastically reversed the roles of labor and laborer. So where once the laborer had been the motor of industry, they had now been displaced by the machine. And this, Marx argued, had exacerbated existing social distinctions and created a situation of radical inequality. So the reversal of momentum that was initiated by industrialization meant that labor had become cheap, it had become abundant and disposable. On the contrary, the factory owner accrued status, capital, power on a scale that was vastly disproportionate to their actual contribution, their personal contribution. So the factory was the kind of zenith of this. It brought together all of these elements under one roof. It was the perfection of industrial capitalism. So I don't think so far I'm really saying anything kind of surprising. And the effects of the factory on the worker were, according to Marx, twofold. So professionally and economically, it reduced them to a state of dual servitude. So the worker was a soldier. They were a slave who was entirely reliant upon the factory owner and the machine that they operated. But factories also affected workers' mental and psychological health as well. So the original version of the factory emphasized these debilitating effects at every opportunity. And on my PowerPoint, I'm going to give the original quotes. It quotes in the original language, and then I will read in English the translation. So you'll see on this slide the German, and then on the next slide the French, since translation is what we're talking about. So in the original German version, Marx argued that in order to acquire any level of proficiency at their new job as machine assistants, the laborer had to devote their entire life to familiarizing themselves with a single machine. I'm sorry that it's kind of stuck behind my face. So it says the worker must be taught from childhood upwards in order that he may learn to adapt his own movements to the uniform and unceasing motion of an automaton. So the worker must be taught from childhood upwards in order that he may learn to adapt. But this professional dedication didn't really yield any kind of individual benefit for the worker. The ghosts of old hierarchies often remained. In the factory, all labor was unskilled labor, right? So the routine, the repetitive nature of life at machinery, indeed at one machine, deprived the work itself of all content. And he said, the special skill of each individual machine operator vanishes. So it deprived the work itself of all content, and the special skill of each individual machine operator vanishes. So, in other words, in the factory, it was impossible for the worker to derive any pleasure or any individual benefit from their work. The work itself was meaningless. All your time in the factory was a kind of dead time. And the dehumanizing nature of this work also affected all other aspects of the worker's life. The factory was all-consuming. And the extreme state of workers' dependencies their dependency had effectively reduced them to a part of the machinery. So, le capital obviously didn't embrace factory labor, but its condemnation of it was less comprehensive than that of the original. So here, machinery deprived work of its interest rather than of its content or its significance. And similarly, the worker's particular skill did not vanish when confronted with the factory owner's power, but instead appeared meager in comparison. So in Le Capital, industrial labor, it was draining, it was demeaning, it certainly wasn't interesting. But the French translation stopped short of claiming that it was pointless or it was deprived of all content. And while the worker might have been disempowered, they nevertheless retained some form of skill. So equally, whereas Das Kapital asserted that in order to master a single machine, children had to subject themselves to it from an early age, French translation observed that every child learns very easily to adapt their movements to the continuous and uniform movement of the automaton. So in outlining the worker's relationship to machinery, Le Capital's focus was significantly different from Das Kapital's. So while, for instance, obviously child labor remained a terrible form of exploitation, Le Capital privileged the workers' skill rather than their subjection. At the very least, the two weren't mutually exclusive. So I think this comparison is interesting because it reveals the potential that these changes had for significantly altering the meaning of the text. So in both languages, Capital addressed the same questions and made the same broad points, but the detail was different, and that could change the tone of the text. So the relationship between, workers, factories, machinery, obviously remained one of subjection and alienation. And in both versions, the skilled worker was reduced to a state of dependency. But in Le Capital, this process was more complicated, and it was less certain. The worker retained skill and individuality. And although both of those were diminishing, the text didn't give any indication that they would be completely obliterated. So the worker remained separate from the machinery that they operated. And in highlighting workers' ability to quickly master machinery, it even hinted that workers could potentially harness industrialization for their own benefit. This will become important later on. So the Marx of Le Capital was subtly but significantly different from the Marx of Das Kapital. The changes were rare, the changes were small, but they altered the tone and the meaning of important sections of the text. So these changes fashioned a Marx that was more permissive, almost, more cautiously optimistic about the situation of the modern worker. So while they might have been engaging with the same work, nominally, Marx's French audience was actually reading something that was reading and interpreting a text that was different from the original. So I think that historians who haven't looked at these translations that much have often argued that they weren't widely read or they weren't widely known, and therefore they're not really of that much relevance to understanding what was going on. And this is certainly true to an extent. I don't really think that many workers went out and bought the whole version of Le Capital in 1875. It certainly seems to have been the case that it didn't meet its audience. But that doesn't mean that they were unfamiliar with it. So in the early 1880s, Gabriel Deville, who was a young associate of the leader of the self-professed French Marxist Jules Gued and Paul Lafargue, who I mentioned before, obtained permission from Marx to publish a short version of the text. And this was designed specifically to address this problem of comprehension. And the resulting book, which was called Le Capital de Karl Marx, first appeared in 1883, and it enjoyed a really high level of exposure. So while it might have been true that few workers read Le Capital, it certainly wasn't the case that they weren't familiar with Marx's ideas. And although it was heavily abridged, the majority of the changes that were made in the translation of Le Capital were also integrated into this text. So I think we can infer one kind of final point from that, which is that these changes were intentional. Despite years and a lot of attention from Marx to correct the discrepancies between the two books' publication, they repeated them rather than reversed them. So, these were not errors of translation. They were a concerted effort to do something. And Marx himself was heavily involved in this process. So he was dissatisfied with the translator's initial work, and he took on actually a lot of the translation work himself. He said that the French translation was, quote, almost a complete rewriting, and that actually this was the final edition of Capital that he personally supervised before he died. And he very frequently drew attention to the changes that he'd made. So in the postface to the 1875 French edition, he suggested that this book possessed, quote, a scientific value independent of the original, and should be consulted even by readers familiar with the German. And actually, Marx had always accepted that such changes would be made. So, from its inception, he'd been kind of indifferent to questions of authenticity, translational authenticity. He agreed with the publisher that the main aim shouldn't be to replicate the original word for word, but to reach as many workers as possible. And unlike their German counterparts, he noted French readers were, quote, always impatient to come to a conclusion, eager to know the connection between general principles and the immediate questions that have aroused their passions. So this different audience would obviously require a different text. And actually, this was Marx's main criticism of the original translation, that it was, quote, far too literal. And actually, Marx had been planning this translation for quite some time. So in January 1863, he wrote to Engels telling him of his plans to translate Das Kapital into French as soon as it was published in German. And this plan actually, it kind of had a form. It wasn't just, him saying, oh, I'd like this to happen. It reappeared in a number of his letters in 1862 and 1863. And he actually even suggested that the French translation would be crucial to the success of the German original as well. So in a letter to Ludwig Kugelmann of the plans in 1862, he confessed, I do not think we can count on it having any effect in Germany until it has been given the seal of approval abroad. So why is this important for us? I think it's sometimes the feeling that Marx only kind of started, tinkering with translations or tinkering with texts that he'd already written later on in his life, when he'd become kind of disillusioned with other things, after it became obvious that the social transformations he predicted weren't materializing. But actually, these plans show something different. The plans for a French translation of Capital at the peak of his success, really, in the early 1860s, show that that wasn't the case. Actually, a translation had been planned since long before either the original was finished or it became clear that his predictions were not materializing. So, in other words, translation and cross-cultural engagement were a central pillar of Marx's project and of his plans for publishing and distributing Capital from the beginning. So, if I can move on. So this kind of French Marx, if you want to call it that, that Marx helped to construct in collaboration with others, was very influential for a lot of French socialists during the 1870s and the 1880s. And now I want to explore that a bit more. Some of the ways that French socialists use the ideas of Marx in their own work. So I'm going to focus on two groups. The first, the Guedists, or the so-called French Marxists, the self-proclaimed French Marxists, and the second, the possibilists. So these were, I suppose, the most kind of prominent and organized groups of revolutionary socialists in France at the time. You know, they both had long-running, quite widely read newspapers. So for the purposes of this paper, the Guedists comprise Jules Gued, and Benoît Malon. So it's a lot of names, but I'm not going to be repeating them that much. So as the kind of self-proclaimed French Marxists, you know, it's the Guedists that first really spring to mind when we're thinking about the relationship between Marx and French theorists. They were kind of big on, you know, talking up their connections to Marx as their intellectual inspiration and also their personal connections to him as well. So, you know, they were heavily involved in the construction and the dissemination of Marx in France and this kind of French Marx. It was Lafargue who found a French publisher for Capital. It was De Vie who abridged the text. And it was Laura Lafargue, who was Paul's wife and Marx's daughter, also a very prominent translator of his work. So she carried out a lot of the other translations. And they also heavily drew upon the ideas of this kind of specific tailored French Marx in their work. So to show this, I want to return to one of the themes that we discussed earlier, or that I discussed earlier, you know, labor and work and industrialization. And this had obviously, particularly in the form of the right to work, have been a central issue for French socialists and actually French politicians across the political spectrum for quite some time in the 19th century. But in the early 1880s, the Guedists mounted a very unusual challenge to this idea of the right to work, which was central to French socialism. So they argued that industrialization had transformed work from a right that had to be defended into one of socialism's biggest problems. So the long hours of, you know, the menial, repetitive labor that we mentioned before were irreparably damaging, both to the individual and to society as a whole. It reduced free individuals to slaves. And the solutions that people had offered up until that point, they said, were not the answer. You know, solutions that were suggesting a return to something else, a return to communal labor, because industrialization had obviously drastically reduced, they said, everybody's quality of life, but you couldn't reverse the process. So yeah, Ged wrote that although traditional social forms may ostensibly persist, small societies like communes had effectively, quote, died the day the steam of a locomotive appeared on the horizon. So demanding, the right to work or a return to communal labor or anything that wasn't part of the solution, it was part of the problem. So according to them, according to the Gedists, it was through industrialization rather than through work that laborers could achieve a better quality of life. So industrialization wasn't inherently bad, it was just badly used. And by turning modern machinery to the benefit of all rather than the few, society could both produce everything that it required and also universally enjoy the greatest privilege known to man, what Lafargue called the right to be lazy, just the title of his book on the subject. In other words, the right to leisure time in which to develop one's own interests, one's own personality. So industrialization was actually a blessing. It could guarantee workers a better life than their predecessors had ever had. Rather, than demanding a return to pre-industrial labor and to the right to work, Gedists said workers should embrace modernization. They should attempt to mold it to their own benefits. So the worker, the newspaper L'Égalité argued, should endeavor to become his own capitalist. Obviously, labor remained important, right? It was essential that people went to work, but for the Gedists, work was a social obligation, it wasn't a right. Its purpose was to create the conditions for social equality, nothing more than that. And this solution set them apart both in French political circles and in a lot of socialist circles as well. And it was built explicitly upon the foundations that were derived from the French Marx, this French Marx. So Lafargue and De Ville obviously were both very familiar with capital. They directly referred to it in their own work on the right to be lazy. And as we've seen in Le Capital, Marx offered an alternative, marginally more optimistic assessment of factory labor. He was more open to the possibility that under certain conditions, under the correct conditions, industrialization could be harnessed to the benefit of workers. And likewise, he left room for workers to sustain interests and a life outside of work. So the right to be lazy, which is really kind of the Gedists and I would say probably all French revolutionary socialists' most original contribution in this period, took direct inspiration for this from Le Capital. None of the other tools that were available to them offered really a solution or a foundation that was close to this. But the Gedists weren't the only French socialists to engage with Marx during this period or to engage with his ideas. So the history of the French workers' movement during this period is really kind of tortured, would be an understatement. And I think as a result of this, people often think that that's the case, that, actually it was only the Gedists who really interacted with Marx. Everybody else was very anti-Marx. So in 1882, the French Workers' Party split, led to the creation of two new parties. So these were, they have very kind of long names and also acronyms, but these were the Gedists and the Possibilists. And the kind of the friction and the recriminations that surrounded these events played out very publicly in the French radical press, and very personally as well, to the extent that, you know, if you look at some letters pages, you can see kind of ordinary party members saying, like, actually, please just, you know, stop having a go at each other. So in this kind of battle, both sides often reverted to the kind of the dichotomous language that had been used during the split, the 1872 split of the First International, between the Marxists and the anarchists, when Mikhail Bakunin and his followers had been thrown out of the International. And this was also an event in which, strategized by Marx and his kind of group. And this was also an event in which lots of French socialists have been involved. So I think historians have often taken this language at kind of face value. You know, they've read intellectual differences into these kind of party political issues and assumed that the possibilists either were not really interested in Marx or they were kind of opposed to him. And this is definitely partly true. You know, there were aspects of Marx's thought and certainly aspects of Marx's action, his conduct, that the possibilists were very opposed to, but they didn't reject him completely. So he actually made quite regular appearances in possibilist publications. He was regularly quoted by their leaders, Proust and Malon. And more importantly, their praise of Marx didn't end after the 1882 split in the Workers' Party. So, for example, after Marx's death a year later, Proust praised him as, quote, a powerful thinker. And in the area of economic analysis and criticism, unparalleled. Malon also lauded Marx as the most eminent of contemporary socialists and the abundant source from which most of modern workers' socialism is drawn. So the possibilist relationship with Marx wasn't just one of kind of distance or disapproval. They obviously rejected certain aspects of his thought and his behavior, but they also praised Marx as an important and an original thinker, and that they continue to do so even as tensions within the French socialist movement were at their highest, is a demonstration both of the strength of their affinity, I think, and of how widespread those sentiments were. So, I mean, my intention isn't really to argue that, you know, the possibilists kind of embraced Marx with open arms, but just that they couldn't accurately be termed anti-Marxists. They took a selective and a non-committal approach to Marx. They praised aspects of his thought. They criticized others. And actually, I mean, if you read the read the writings of, you know, other groups, other socialist groups in France, this approach wasn't just restricted to them. Even the Guettists weren't interested in parroting Marx's kind of changing thought point by point. So Marx's changing ideas about the kind of the revolutionary potential of communes is a good example of this. And they just, you know, did not go along with this, did not go along with the idea that the commune could be an important site of revolution. So the use of Marx and his ideas by French socialists in this period was, it was widespread and it was reflexive. It wasn't just, you know, the property of one group. Lots of different people use Marx in lots of different ways. They highlighted particular aspects of his thought. They ignored others. And so, you know, mentions of Marx and Marxism were kind of ever present in socialist thought during this period, although Marxism as a kind of a doctrine, a set of ideas that was rigidly adhered to, was much harder to find. It might actually be better to think of it as a kind of a lexicon or a dictionary that lots of different French socialists, and I should say not only socialist parts of the revolutionary movement, but also other parts, drew on in different ways in order to communicate with each other, with other people, to kind of articulate possible responses to social problems. So the history of French Marxism during this period then was a lot more complex and interconnected than has previously been suggested. French activists, they toyed with labels like Marxist, anarchist, but these terms didn't necessarily denote any kind of a meaningful intellectual identification or content. So, as Proust observed, Marxism is not about being a partisan of Marx's ideas. And in an 1882 letter to Engels, this is the one I wanted. In an 1882 letter to Engels, Lafargue explained, "In Paris, the word anarchist is understood in a very different sense from that of 1871. And even the anarchists themselves do not agree on the meaning of the term. Many think like us, but it's a feather they like to wear in their hat. If it gives them pleasure, so much the better." So in Paris, the word anarchist is understood in a very different sense from that of 1871. Fair enough. Even the anarchists themselves do not agree on the meaning of the term. Many think like us, but it's a feather they like to wear in their hat. If it gives them pleasure, so much the better. So I suppose what I'm trying to argue is that we can't kind of fold this history of French Marxism into the kind of national, social, political, organizational history of the workers' movement, or the different groupings that constituted it. Because that kind of structure, that kind of framework can't explain how this language of Marxism moved and how it spread. So various different groups all drew on the language of Marx and Marxism, but they didn't do so identically. And on subjects like the revolutionary potential of communes, lots of different French socialists were able to violently disagree with each other while all drawing upon Marx's work. So they weren't kind of trying to attempting to kind of faithfully recreate an authentic Marx. So Marx and Marxism in late 19th century France, they signified many things to many different people all at the same time. And, approaching this subject matter as the kind of the search for a defined French Marxism fails to capture its complexity. And also the kind of the basic character of the ways that French activists during this period interacted with Marx. So I just want to quickly conclude. So French socialist relationship with Marx in the 1870s and the early 1880s has often been characterized as one of distance, of disdain, of kind of accidental misinterpretation. Because the French theorists just weren't sophisticated enough to, understand. And it's certainly true that Marx, like Engels, frequently found these French socialists very infuriating, actually, not just frustrating, but infuriating. He got very annoyed with them and, said things quite like that. And it's tempting to view all of Marx's interactions with French socialists and with kind of France and the socialist movement there during this period through that lens of frustration. But what I hope that I have demonstrated is that the relationship between Marx and French socialism was actually much more than that. That it was an intellectual relationship that was characterized by reflexivity, experimentation, and exchange as well. Marx might have been frustrated with his French sons-in-law actually, and their colleagues. But he didn't withdraw or keep his distance from French politics because of that. He was actually attuned to the kind of the specific circumstances of France during this period, and sensitive to the need to tailor his own work to a French audience. Really from the 1860s onwards. And he was also himself deeply personally involved in this project. He helped to create, through the translation of his work, a distinctive version of it. And French socialists in turn drew heavily on that French Marx. Lots of different revolutionary groups used aspects of Marxist thought as kind of building blocks for creating their own solutions to contemporary social problems. So Marx's ideas were not functioning as a kind of an orthodoxy to be faithfully replicated, but a language for discussing and working through their own ideas. So Peter Ghosh has recently argued in actually an article on intellectual biographies of Marx that is more productive to conceive of the construction of ideologies in terms of a, quote, stream of ideas, in which a thinker and their context and their reception, both contemporary and posthumous, all contribute to the ways in which their ideas are shaped and the ways in which their ideas are understood. And I think that that is a useful concept here. The relationship between Marxists, and Marxism in London and in France during this period was a multi-layered and constantly changing one. It was a process of collaboration between Marx, between French activists, and the circumstances in which they found themselves on both sides of the channel. So I think I'm going to leave it there. And thank you everybody for listening. And I will try to unshare my screen.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was just wonderful and overwhelming for all of us, I think. The rich temporal, spatial, cross-cultural, and even linguistic filtering of or embellishment of Marx. And you've given us so much to think about. So this rich material, we'll have to sit with this for a long time to come. But I think if I cannot cap the enthusiasm of audience, we have about 30 minutes of questions. So we can start now. You can, again, use the chat function to pose your questions or use the raised hand function. From what I understand, Solange had a question, so we can start with that, and then the rest of you can jump in.
Yes, thank you so much, Julia, for your talk. I thought that was fascinating, especially in terms of the translation and how that sort of was intentionally changed. So first question, as someone not working on this period at all, I was wondering when did this kind of get rectified, and until when does this translation, or until when is this specific translation very influential? And then I have a bit of a confused question, in fact, because it reminded me a bit of Michael Kelly's sort of reading of Hegelianism and sort of introduction of Hegel in France via these radicals coming from Germany as German exiles to France, and kind of introducing Hegel there. And sort of his conclusion is that, well, in general, the introduction of Hegel in France is kind of considered only through an academic institutional lens, and it's not kind of looked at from a bottom-up perspective, like what are activists really doing at the moment. And of course, it's kind of the way it gets introduced kind of through Proudhon, of course, that Marx then afterwards also criticizes Proudhon's reading of Hegel, which in part he actually gets through these conversations with Marx himself. So I was wondering if that's really, is it this kind of approach that you're looking at to really look at texts by activists as well, and how they are engaging with it? Because you mentioned Lafargue and these kinds of texts. Are you also looking at specific kind of activists, militant circles at the time?
Thank you. Yeah, they're really interesting questions. Especially the second one, it's a lot to think about. I mean, I suppose the answer is, or if the question is, am I looking at texts by activists in that period? I suppose the answer is yes, in that they're by journalists. You know, Devy is a journalist, Lafargue is a journalist who later becomes a deputy. So they're journalists. I mean, they are very involved in kind of activist circles. Yes, you know, they kind of go to prison several times. They are the leaders of the French Workers' Party. They're very much not, you know, academics. They never held a kind of an academic position or anything like that. And so in that sense, yes. But I also, maybe, I mean, if somebody kind of knows different, I would be interested to be corrected. But I'm not sure that there is really a huge amount of academic engagement with Marx's texts in France in kind of the 1870s or the early 1880s. I know that there's a letter written, I believe it's by Marx, but I would have to look it up to be certain, that he's very kind of irritated by the fact that the kind of people he wanted to be reading Capital in French aren't reading the book, or he doesn't really have any sense that they're reading the book. And actually the only reviews that he's seen are by people who he doesn't consider his target audience, or, you know, or perhaps it's the letters from Engels. And, you know, people like Clemenceau are kind of carrying around their copies of Le Capital, and like, this just isn't what he was hoping for. So it would be interesting to explore, you know, those kinds of reviews that do come in kind of academic publications, and to see whether, you know, Clemenceau or those kinds of radicals wrote anything about it. But I don't know personally, because I haven't kind of looked through their archives. The question of until when is this translation used is an interesting one. I believe that this is still the translation that's used in French. I think that, I mean, certainly in, you know, the 1960s, this is what Althusser is reading, I believe. So yes, I mean, it's possible that there's, I'm sure there have been other translations, but I think that this is still reproduced. Yeah.
Okay, great. So Luke had a question. Luke Wilkinson, you can go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's a basic question, but you were talking about reflexivity. I was just wondering how much this process of translation that Marx, as you say, is actively involved in, and the response by French Marxists influences Marxist thought itself. You have this happening perhaps a bit more later in Marx's life with the Russian strand, potentially with, he's not a Marxist necessarily, but Chernyshevsky and others influencing his thought. Does that happen in France?
Thanks. It's a good question. I think the point of the translation being different is that he is influenced by French circumstances, and he realizes that the circumstances are very different in France than they are in the UK or in Germany or somewhere else like that. That it doesn't seem to be following the same kind of path of industrialization or at the same speed, and that actually people are quite proud of having this big kind of rural small holding class and things like that, and so he needs to appeal to something quite different. So he's influenced by the circumstances, and there are kind of interesting there are some interesting things in the translation of Capital that occur, as far as I'm aware, there earlier than they do in other parts of Marxist thought. So, for example, in this translation, he acknowledges that not every country in the world is or not every part of the world is going to go through, or necessarily has to go through a similar kind of stages of development. And I think that that's something he, more famously acknowledges kind of later on, at the beginning of the 1880s, that actually is present in this translation. So things like that are interesting. If the question is whether his thought was influenced or he was influenced by people like Lafargue and Gued, then I think the answer to that has to be a resounding no, actually. I said that he is kind of frustrated by them, frequently frustrated by them, and he really was he does not have nice things to say about their kind of their kind of theoretical capabilities. So I think, in that sense, no, but there are other interesting things there.
Thanks.
So we also have a question from the chat from Will Roberts, which reads, I'm very interested in this period as well. Do you know anything concrete about the interactions among Gued, Lafargue, Deville, and Lizagarret? There is an ad for a bookshop that ran in Lizagarret's paper from the early 80s that advertises Le Capital, alongside books by Gued and Malon, all under the heading of Republican Socialist Propaganda. Is there research into the social milieu of this group?
That's a really interesting question. I know anecdotal things about it. I know that all of these books, as you said, were advertised in his paper, which was a relatively widely read paper. As part of I think a kind of like a workers' library. I think that's how they were advertised. Certainly in other papers, I can't remember whether it was Lizagarret's or not. But I do know that certainly at some points I know that the relationship was quite fraught. I think that would be a correct way to put it. And actually, so Lafargue was married to Laura, Marx's daughter. Lizagarret was engaged or wished to be married to Marx's youngest daughter, Eleanor. And Eleanor actually assisted in the English translation of Le Sagare's Histoire de la Commune. So Le Sagare was in London after the Commune, in exile, and working and in the same circles as these people. I believe that Marx refused permission for Le Sagare and Eleanor to marry. And I know that Lafargue and Le Sagare did not like each other. There's a quote somewhere that says they refused to even shake hands when they saw each other in Marx's house. I don't know how that translates into the politics of it. I haven't seen anything that makes connections between those two things. So I don't want to kind of conjecture or, you know, suggest things that I don't actually know are true. But this is what I know about that relationship. And it's very interesting. And I would very much like to read about, I would love to read research on that. Yeah. I know that, I mean, there's definitely work on communal exiles in London in the 1870s and the 1880s. So perhaps that mentions it, but yeah, I'm sorry that I can't be more helpful.
Thank you. So it's going to be Pierre, David, and Owen in that order. So Pierre first.
Thank you for the fantastic presentation. A question about still about Lafargue, so maybe you have already more or less answered, but I'm specifically interested in the concept of the right to be lazy, which I find absolutely amazing. Do we know whether Marx had the occasion to comment on it? I checked that the book was published in the same year when Marx died, so maybe he had no occasion to hear of it, or maybe in the development of this concept he had the occasion to comment.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question, actually. You're right. I think the book was published in the same year that Marx died. It was originally published as a series of articles in their newspaper L'Égalité, which I think was published the year before. Certainly in the beginning of the 1880s, possibly even the year before that. I don't know whether he commented on it or not, actually. Not that I recall. I don't recall any kind of specific references to it or coming across any specific references to it in the correspondence. But that doesn't mean that it's not there, because it's been, you know, it's been a while since I looked. So yeah, it would definitely be interesting to look. Possibly it would be more likely to come up in the correspondence between Lafargue and Engels, because I think their correspondence is more extensive. There are 3 published volumes of it. And yeah, so it could come up there. I'm sorry that, yeah, I can't give a more definitive answer. But I just wanted to follow up on Will Roberts' question as well. The research on communal exiles in London that I was thinking of is by Laura Forster. So yeah, possibly that mentions it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. David can go next.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. I thought the things that you said about the translations and their significance were really, really compelling. My question is just about, at what point did groups in France start trying to establish themselves as the authentic Marxists? And how did they try and go about doing that? And to what extent do you think they succeeded? I guess I'm thinking particularly here of the Geddists, who, my sense is at least by the early 20th century, had begun to establish themselves pretty well as the people in France who got to define what orthodoxy was. I wondered if you could say a bit about that process, how much you think that actually was the case, and how did that feature in discussions about Marx in France? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. And yes, I think definitely you're right that by the 20th century, they had established themselves as such. I think probably even before that as well. I would say even from the 1890s. So it's interesting because there's this kind of this period of the 1870s and the 1880s where they have quite a kind of, I guess, permissive interpretation. Although I should say, even at that point, the Geddists are claiming that they are the one true, interpreters of Marx. So they say even then, like, oh, well, who's he? Like, he doesn't really understand anything, like he hasn't read Marx that clearly. So they're already trying to do that, or they're already claiming that. But then from the early 1890s or the late 1880s, you have an interesting phenomenon of people like Lafargue and Devy disavowing their own interpretation of Marx from 10 years before. So, they actually apologize for it. And they say like, oh, well, actually, we didn't know anything in like the 1870s. We hadn't read anything carefully enough. And actually, our interpretation is this, which is a lot more of a kind of like what you might expect an orthodox, a kind of a more rigid orthodox interpretation of Marxism to be. And at the same time, I think you see the possibilists back off a little bit. And that could be, I mean, the question is then why, right? Like, why did they kind of change their mind? In the 1890s, I think it could be to do with a lot of different things. And obviously, we're never going to know exactly because we can't ask them. I mean, Marx died in 1883, and the kind of the version of Marxism that was disseminated by Engels was perhaps more kind of orthodox than kind of Marx's, belief that there should be these different versions. And I think, I mean, it also has to do with perhaps like French electoral politics and things like that as well, that by the late 1880s and the early 1890s, they were thinking a lot more seriously about, running for election. I think Lafargue is actually elected to Parliament in 1891. So I think perhaps, there is a desire to stake out a claim for yourself, stake out a unique claim for yourself and your party, right? Or your group, to get a unique selling point. And for the Geddists, that became Marx, or they really kind of leaned into their status as the self-professed Marxists, the French Marxists. So I think I would say it's probably from around then, from the 1890s.
Thanks. I think Owen can go next.
Sure, thanks. And thanks, Julia, for your paper. I really enjoyed listening to that. And I wanted to actually pick up on something you were just saying with regard to Engels propagating a kind of orthodoxy, I suppose, after Marx's death, but thinking that across to the question of translation, and particularly English translations, I suppose. I mean, I wondered whether there's a larger story to be told here about not only kind of German into French translations, but then the English translations, because the first the kind of authorized translation of Capital, the more Aveling translation, is, what is it, 1886, 1887, after Marx's death. But Hindman sort of pips them to the post, and Engels gets a bit annoyed about that and writes in the Commonweal in 1885 an article called "How Not to Translate Marx." You probably know it, right? And Engels starts by saying, reiterating what I think you were saying about Marx's attitude to translation, that it can just be portable and it's public property and anyone can translate it. And if that means that it slightly changes the meaning in some of the ways that you were alluding to, that's okay. People will read it differently. Engels, partly because I think he wants to kind of, guard the authorized English translation, is actually quite annoyed that Broadhouse, Hindman under the pseudonym of Broadhouse, kind of gets there slightly first. And I think they were already annoyed at Hindman anyway for kind of plagiarizing some of Marx's views in one of his early books and so on. But I just wondered whether, that some of those questions are live ones for you. What happens to that question of translation after Marx's death? And then, what about this question of the English translations as well?
Thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I actually, I don't know a huge amount about the English context. So it's really interesting to hear those things. And I think it's a really good point. I think, yeah. And I suppose there's also a sense that, perhaps, on Engels's part, there's also a sense of wanting to kind of solidify somebody's legacy after they've died, right? And their ideas, and make sure that they don't end up kind of getting lost because they're too muddled. That's really, really interesting. And I think it's a really good point, because when I was thinking about this initially, I really did conceive of it as this kind of this period where things, as a kind of a chronologically specific thing that is confined to the 1870s or the 1860s to the 1890s. And actually, over the course of kind of thinking about it more in conversations with other people, and now this with you as well, I think that, I think that that's not necessarily the case. That might have been the case in France, but it's not necessarily true of elsewhere, that other people are still trying to do these kinds of translations, or there are still, although, there is this story of kind of increasing orthodoxy, there is at the same time diverse interpretations, and those diverse interpretations and diverse translations perhaps persist as well. So, I mentioned Peter Ghosh in at the end of the paper, but I think he actually suggested that, it would be interesting to have almost like one for every country or one for every language, right? Like thinking about what's happened to capital in French, or what's happened to it in the English context, what happened to it in the German context, and thinking about people like, like Kautsky, or kind of, later theorists. But yeah, that's really interesting. And I definitely think that the kind of the variety of interpretations persists even as this kind of, move towards orthodoxy also grows.
Yeah. So Sam has a question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Hi, Julia. Thanks for the paper. It's great. I was just very interested in the right to be lazy stuff, which has been mentioned, and kind of this kind of emancipatory kind of conception of technology, etc., etc. And I was just wondering how it kind of, whether it affected their kind of notion of proletarian agency at all? You know, is this potentially kind of decentering the kind of revolutionary kind of engine, as it were, in the proletariat, or do they kind of conceive it as kind of bolstering it? And I was just wondering also about kind of the rejection of kind of Marx's turn to the Commune, and how they were kind of conceiving kind of notions of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm just going to write down the second one so I don't forget it. So actually, maybe I can answer that one first. In terms of the rejection of Marx's turn to the Commune, I don't want to be unkind about them, but I don't know how deeply they kind of thought about this. I think that from what I've read, they conceived of, kind of proletarian revolution and the progress of proletarian revolution in very kind of perhaps simplistic terms of, the problem with the Commune is that it's a local thing and it's not going to affect change. And so everything needs to happen at a national or an international, a global level. And that's the only thing that is kind of satisfactory. And, like quite a basic understanding. And I think that's why Marx was annoyed with them a lot of the time, because he thought that their understandings, or he thought that their readings of things were quite superficial. I suppose if you read it within the context of French politics or French socialist politics, the possibilists, so named because they only wanted to do, or, they wanted to focus on change that was possible or change that was achievable. Perhaps their kind of, if I'm being more charitable, perhaps their focus on kind of bigger action was conceived of in contrast to the possibilists and as a way of distinguishing themselves. But I don't think that they theorized or thought that deeply about it. The right to be lazy, and how does it affect proletarian agency? It's a very good question, actually. And one that I hadn't particularly thought about before, but yes, it does kind of present a problem for that, doesn't it? But if you're all kind of off enjoying yourselves, then perhaps you're not fomenting a revolution. I suppose I could talk more about the idea of the right to be lazy. It's really like a kind of like a response to alienation, right? And this idea that kind of people their individuality is dulled by industrial labor. And that it's very important for people to overcome that, for laborers to overcome that. And because it's not possible to do that anymore through your work, you can't derive any enjoyment from your work because you're just working in a factory. You have to do that through leisure time. So that's the real luxury now. That's, the thing that only the bourgeoisie have. And that's the thing that the proletariat have to capture. That's what they have to get. They have to win the right to dispose of their own time how they want to. And that is only possible through industrialization and through kind of they actually use quite interesting language when they're talking about this, and that is actually where my kind of idea for thinking about comparisons between slavery and wage labor came from, that there's quite a striking quote in, I think, this abridged version of Capital, the long introduction that is prefaced by, where Devy talks about, or refers to machines as iron slaves, and says that, you know, machines are basically going to function as slaves. And because we will have that, we will be able to, you know, like the liberation of everybody will be possible. So that doesn't really answer your question, but I think that's, yeah, what I have to say on the right to be lazy. But thank you for your question.
Oh. So, yes, I think we're just in time to finish. I hope there are no more questions. Yeah. Okay, great then. Thank you so much, Julia, once again. The variegated nature of ideas, texts, exegesis, which were brought forth in the panels today, found their meeting point in your talk, and they were re-emphasized. So it was wonderful. That makes for a successful day. And we had technologically smooth functioning as well. So thank you very much again, both for participants and Keynote again, for joining us today and for your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.